Hi, I'm Amy from During Quiet Time. Do you like to collect salvages like I do? I love the combination of the fabric print along with the text that the designer has chosen. A lot of the fabrics that are being made now have really interesting salvage edges, like this one with Penny Arcade. It has little circle designs here, a little flower, as well as the fabric collection, the date that the fabric was made, the designer's name. They also have colored dots on the fabrics to show what colors are in the print. Here's a great example from Art Gallery. And here, instead of using dots, they've used little flowers, which I absolutely love. I'll buy fabric just to get a fun salvage like that for my collection sometimes. I like to use these because they're so interesting and they can remind you of the fabric that you've used over the years if you collect them. And then if you sew them all into a new project, you're kind of creating a memory scrapbook with fabric. And I think that that's a fun idea. And you're also using every little bit of your fabric. I'm often asked how I go about cutting my salvages for a project. I really like preserving some of the fabric, both so that I can see the pattern and also so they get some of the color. If you cut them very thin, like right here, you'll have to overlap your next salvage, for example, very close like this, and then you don't end up with any color. You only end up with the white salvages. So when I prepare a salvage, I'll cut this before I start cutting my project fabric, and I'll just go from the edge here. I will make my ruler line up with the edge of the salvage at least a ½ inch. That's pretty much my minimum. I'll usually go more like an inch, like this. So an inch and a half from the edge in this case, but all the salvage finished edges are different widths. So really what I'm doing is measuring an inch of the actual fabric design, and then I cut that off. And then this goes into the salvage box. So I want to talk a little bit about the properties of a salvage and what kind of projects they're good for. The salvage edge is a tighter weave, which is why you cut it off when you're making a project. And you can see here how it has pulled a little bit, so it doesn't go straight and flat like this. And sometimes it happens once you've ironed it, sometimes it happens just as you cut it off. So I've found that it's more successful to make projects where you only use short sections of a salvage so that you can flatten them out like that and pin and keep them straight in your project. It's much harder over a long stretch. For today I'm going to use gray salvages. So I've pulled a bunch of salvages that have mainly gray in the fabric print. Because I like to use my salvages to create blocks of color, I mostly save salvages that read as one color. So like this salvage has a little bit of color in there, but I consider it reading as gray. I don't tend to save multicolored salvages quite as much because they don't tend to help in the designs I like to make with them. So today I'm going to use these gray salvages to show you how I would sew a salvage block. First we're going to press them. To pin the salvages, I like to use my Daylight Company wafer light box. I like that because you can see exactly where your fabric is and how much each of them are going to overlap. Also, it helps in keeping the fabric straight if you can use a grid like this. This is a cutting mat that comes with, or you purchase it separately actually, but it goes with the light box. And it can be cut on top of the light box as well. So I'm going to place my foundation lined up with one of the grids here. And then I'm going to take the scrap fabric and place it at least a ½ inch or so into the block design. That way when I cover a ¼ inch or so of the block, of the fabric rather, with my salvage, I just get a little strip of color there. I'm going to pin this in place. Now I'm going to take my first salvage, and the finished edge here is what we're going to put a ¼ inch beyond this first scrap, roughly a ¼ inch. It does not need to be precise, but this is where you can use the lines on your grid to just kind of see if you're keeping your salvages relatively straight. And then I can put a pin on that as well. And then we can just cut off the excess here. And that way we don't waste any of the salvage, and we can still use this for another block. Alright, so now we're at our sewing machine. I like to choose a neutral color thread. Here I have just an off-white thread, which tends to work pretty well with the salvages since they're either a white or an off-white most of the time. And I don't want to have to change it with every row I stitch, so I just go with the neutral. And I like to use an edge stitching foot. This is the edge stitching foot for my Janome machine. And what we're going to do here is just line up the edge stitching foot with the edge of the salvage, and that helps me stitch close to the edge of the salvage and also keep my line looking fairly straight. And I shortened my stitch a little bit too, to about a 1.8 or a 2 millimeter stitch, because we do have to remove the paper, so it helps make the perforations a little bit bigger and paper removal easier later on. So I'm going to start stitching, and I'm going to back stitch a little bit within the seam allowance and then continue on down the salvage. Now we're ready to place our second salvage. Some salvages, rather than having a smooth finished edge like this one, will have sort of a frayed or furry edge. And I've noticed that some people like to trim that off. I like to leave it because I think it just adds a little variety and texture to your salvage blocks. I also want to point out that you can fussy cut with salvages. If your fabric has a little design, like let's say there was a row of some sort of animal or a graphic design like triangles going across here, you might choose to position your next salvage far enough so that you can see that little strip. You can also position your salvage so that you can fussy cut the text on it. So in this case, I want to fit the collection name and the designer name going across. So I'm just going to center them. So this salvage must be placed 1/4 of an inch or so over the raw edge here. And then it's up to me to decide how much of the zipper print I want to show. Let's see, this just moved on me a little bit. I'm going to straighten that out. I'm going to line up the edge of the salvage with this line on my cutting mat, and then I'm going to pin. And when I pin, I like to smooth the salvage with my fingers a little bit because of that tension that I mentioned before that's caused by the tighter weave on the edge, and this helps keep it a little bit straighter when I firmly pin it down. And now we're ready to stitch. So when we stitch, I'm not going to put my edge foot along the edge of the frayed edge because I'll end up stitching within the frayed edge and then that won't hold my salvage. So I'm going to just eyeball it for this one and stitch a little bit closer in. So similar to paper piecing, you want to trim down this excess seam allowance to only be 1/4 of an inch or so. That's close enough to 1/4 inch for me, so I'm just going to leave this one. But after I apply the next salvage, you can see that I'm going to need to cut off some of this. So I just wanted to mention that. I'm going to trim this edge off now so I can save the rest for another project. And then we'll lay our next salvage on top, extending at least, or showing at least 1/4 of an inch of this fabric and extending at least 1/4 inch beyond that one. Because I feel like you want to show at least that 1/4 inch or so just to make it more colorful. And because it's a wide salvage, I cut off plenty of fabric. I can show a little bit more if I'd like. So I'm going to line that up again, pin, smooth, and pin again. Now I'll use my edge stitching foot to stitch along here. So now we're going to trim this back, as I mentioned. I like to trim these from the salvage side because there's just a little bit of bulk here and I don't want to accidentally be trimming from this side and cut through my salvage. So I fold the paper foundation back just hold the selvage back with my fingers. And this doesn't have to be a perfect 1/4 of an inch, so it doesn't matter how precise I'm being, and I just cut that off. And now I'm ready to continue all the way up to the top of the foundation. The last selvage that I apply, I want to have extend all the way into the seam allowance here. So it'll be placed like so that the whole seam allowance is covered with fabric. Okay, now our final step is simply to trim down the block. And there's your finished selvage block. They're very easy to construct and they're a lot of fun. They get very addictive. You want to buy more and more fabric for more and more selvages, and you find yourself going to your fabric cabinet and cutting off selvages just for your salvage project, which is kind of funny. This video supports 2 of my patterns. The circuitry quilt can be found in my book, Intentional Piecing. It's made in a similar manner as the sample block today. You can find my Salvage Whirlwind PDF pattern in my pattern shop on duringquiettime.com or my During Quiet Time Etsy shop. Are you ready to raid your stash for salvages?